Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here at the Bank of Slovenia, all of you sitting here in auditorium, all of those who are following us through video link, and of course my dear colleagues, the panelists of today's discussion. From monetary part of the panel, there is Isabel Schnabel, Executive Board of the ECB member, Peter Kažimir, my colleague from Central Bank of Slovakia, but also experienced fiscal policy maker, and then from the fiscal part, Minister of Finance from Republic of Slovenia, Klemen Boštjančič, and Nadia Calviño, Deputy Prime Minister of Spain, who will contribute through video link. Our discussion today will be moderated by Professor Mojmir Mrak, and he was heavily involved with policy making in Slovenia on fiscal part, on monetary part, so no need to further introduction. And of course, he will be a natural choice to lead us through today's discussion. Now, our main motivation why we gathered today is a very complex nature of policy challenge we are all faced with. Let me just mention three different aspects. The first one being the fact that we are just in the middle of the second consecutive crisis. Firstly, it was a COVID pandemic, and then it was Russia aggression in Ukraine. The second thing is the way how the enterprises, households reacted to this changed environment. And the third important aspect is how we as a policymaker responded to changed environment, to significantly change macroeconomic situation. All that resulted in an environment when inflation has been increasing for quite a period and is now at the highest level for many years, somewhere for many decades. And basically in all of our countries represented at the panel, it's about 10%. Then there is a growth prospect, which is decelerating significantly at the moment. And the third element, we are observing increased nervousness at the financial markets. Now the data is still good, nothing significantly bad has happened till now, but it's a fact that the risk has increased significantly, and there is great worriedness what will happen in the next period. So what we'll be discussing today is the response of our policies. Firstly, monetary policy, fiscal policy, and equally important, how they should interact. Here, I believe we learned a lot from the previous crisis episode from the COVID period, where it was of the crucial importance that both policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy, were very much aligned towards the same goal. And needless to say, that caused a relatively fast rebound from the previous crisis, and also which also went without disturbances on the financial markets. So, economic policy alignment is equally important today at this juncture of, as I said, high inflation, deteriorating prospects for growth, and very tense situation in labor market. And our success with fighting inflation depends crucially on this balance of different policy measures and how we will align them, that they will all direct into the same direction. But since I'm supposed to have just an opening address, I will not go into the details of what we'll be doing. I will just leave this for our panel discussion. So I hope you will enjoy it and also participate with your comments and your questions. So I will stop here and give the floor to Professor Mrak to lead us through the panel. Please.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Let me first express my gratitude to the Bank of Slovenia and the governor for giving me this opportunity to operate as a moderator of this roundtable. I would like to just to mention here that this event is taking place in a kind of a hybrid form. So in addition to you who are here with us, we have also an audience of, I don't know precisely the number, but significantly more than 100 people following us online. So it's a pretty broad group. And I do really expect that we will have a fruitful discussion on the topic which was mentioned. The governor already mentioned that we are living in a very, let's say, challenging environment. He mentioned the two most recent crises. I will still broaden this a little bit broader. I think at the global level, two things, at least two really major developments will shape our life in future. One is that we are undergoing a big shift in the economic governance in general. So what I say is we are moving from a kind of rule-based international economic system to much more a system which is based on the deal-based. And of course, this kind of a system, which is in this multipolar world, is much more fragile. So one thing what we can expect in future is to have more, let's say, challenges in running this relationship among these groups. That's one thing. And another thing which I would like to underline here is this issue of the climate changes. I selected two of them. I think you follow what's going on also in Sharm el-Sheikh these days. It's, at least how I read this, is not very promising. So you have the feeling that there is a little bit of tracking back on the ambitions related to these objectives which we put in the Paris in this area. On the EU side, well, let's say more narrower, we have been going not just with these two crises which were mentioned by the government, but I think we are living over the last decade in crisis in the EU. It was a financial crisis first, and all these things developed. We had then the migrant crisis, and then the most recent ones for the COVID crisis. I think we cannot say this is over. If you see in some other parts of the world, it still have very strong implications, which have also implications for us. And of course, the most recent, these things going on with the crisis after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have a large kind of uncertainties regarding the economic growth. There is discussion about where we are on the edge of recession. For the time being, it's not considered to be a very long one, but we are in a very challenging environment. In this environment, we have this objective of our roundtable to discuss macro, fiscal, monetary issues and the implication of the financial system. So I think we have three pillars: macro, fiscal, and financial stability. Already the governor explained or presented at the beginning. We have an excellent, really excellent panel here. First, I will go on the order here. Mrs. Isabel Schnabel, she is a member of the executive board of the European Central Bank. Before, she was also acting in the German Council of Economic Experts. We always listen very carefully when they say something. And she had also then previous an academic career. So I would say experience on both sides, on the policy making extremely rich, and then now of course also on the academic side. Unfortunately, we don't have with us Mrs. Nadia Calviño, the Minister of Economic Affairs and Digital Transformation, but she will be with us in a virtual forum, so she will give also an address and also answer a couple of questions. Also, she has a very, I would say, rich experience on different ministerial posts in Spain, but all of them on economics, finance, and then more than 10 years of experience in the European Commission, including the position of the Director General for the budget. So I think we have again a person who is very knowledgeable on the issues we'll be talking about. Klemen Boštjančič is the Minister of Finance from the country we are in, from Slovenia. He started his post this spring. I don't know what was June when the government took over. But then before he had a lot of experience in the corporate finance issues in different capacities. The next in this our line is Mr. Peter Kažimir. I had the privilege of meeting him already once here. Last year we had a discussion on some other issues. Governor of the Central Bank of Slovakia, now for a couple of years already disposed, but before that, through all these financial turbulences in Europe, the Minister of Finance of Slovakia. So I would not like to say a combination, but knowing the both sides extremely well. And finally, our host, which we all know here, Governor Boštjan Vasle, with also rich experience before on the macroeconomic side as a director of IMAT. How we'll run this roundtable? At the beginning, each of the panelists will have up somewhere 5-6 minutes opening address to provide general views on the topic of our roundtable. And then I organized the discussion around 3-4 major sets of questions where I will ask participants to give their views, but of course I also reactions of the other panelists on individual questions, topics which were raised. We will also open the floor for a certain number of questions from the audience, and that will be somehow I plan to wrap up this contribution. So without any further introductory words, I would like that we start with these introductory interventions by the panelists, and here I would like you, Mrs. Schnabel, for your first intervention, presentation. I know that you also prepared a few slides for us, so please, the floor is yours.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. And first of all, I would like to thank our host, the Bank of Slovenia, and of course my dear colleague, Boštjan. I hope this time I pronounced it correctly, for inviting me to this excellent panel. It's a great pleasure to be here in Slovenia. So in my introductory remarks, I'm going to talk about the persistence of inflation in the euro area and what this implies for our monetary policy going forward. In my speech in Jackson Hole in August, I argued that the ECB needs to act forcefully in order to bring inflation back to our target in a timely manner. And I presented 3 arguments why central banks should err on the side of determination. The first was the uncertainty about the persistence of inflation. The second was threats to central bank credibility. And the third was the potential costs of acting too late. And as you all know, for some time, central banks and many other experts believed that the observed supply side shocks like the supply bottlenecks, the rising freight costs, the energy price increases would fade quickly because they were inherently transitory. In reality, however, the shocks have not faded as quickly as expected, and new shocks have occurred. In fact, inflationary pressures have broadened substantially, and they also crept into what we call underlying inflation, which stands at historically high levels between 5 and 8%, and that's shown on the left-hand side. So this is kind of trying to capture the persistent part of inflation. And you can see on the right-hand side that underlying inflation continues to show a very strong momentum with the month-on-month changes of HICP-X, so excluding energy and food, on an increasing trend. And while our monetary policy needs to remain firmly guided by the medium-term inflation outlook due to the transmission lags of our policies, current inflation dynamics matter to the extent that they help us to better understand the persistence of inflation. Our models have tended to underestimate inflation dynamics because they did not capture properly the persistence of shocks, underestimating, for example, the strong pass-through from wholesale to retail energy prices and from energy prices to the entire consumption basket. And as the dynamics of headline inflation will increasingly be blurred by base effects from energy price inflation, underlying inflation, which tends to be much stickier, will give a better picture of the persistence of inflation going forward. A long period of very high inflation is likely to have an impact on inflation expectations. And the anchoring of inflation expectations could turn a series of transitory shocks into a persistent inflation problem that would be very expensive to resolve. And that is the reason why we monitor inflation expectations very carefully in order to counter early signs of the anchoring. The good news is that inflation expectations remain broadly anchored at around 2%, which is our medium-term inflation target. However, several observations require us to be cautious, and you can see them on the slide. So first, our survey of professional forecasters, that's shown on the very left, shows a very steep upward trend, with mean longer-term inflation expectations having moved first towards but then above 2%. Second, that's the next chart, the entire distribution of expectations has shifted to the right, with the right-hand side tail, so this is the expectation that inflation will be very high, fattening substantially. And then on the right-hand side, you see results from our consumer expectation survey, so that's a survey among households, which confirms both the upward trend in inflation expectations and the fattening of the right-hand side tail. Third, market prices suggest an elevated probability that inflation over 5 years, in 5 years, remains above 3%. And there is no comparable movement on the other side of the distribution. And finally, and that's the right-hand side of this chart, ECB staff analysis suggests that higher perceived inflation today has a substantial impact on people's inflation expectations, and this impact has actually been rising. And hence, there is a risk that current high inflation feeds into higher inflation expectations, especially if inflation stays far above our target for an extended period of time. Inflation expectations may, of course, affect the wage setting process, potentially giving rise to what we call second round effects. And in fact, if you look at the left-hand side chart, you can see that wage growth has been picking up significantly, especially when looking at real-time data. That is the green line in the left chart. And with real wages declining sharply, that's shown on the right-hand side, there is, of course, a strong desire to make up for lost real income. Meanwhile, workers' bargaining power is strengthened by a historically tight labor market, which is increasingly constraining production, as shown on the right-hand side. So the question, of course, is, and I'm happy to also discuss that further, what does this imply for monetary policy? The data I presented to you suggests that the risk of higher inflation persistence has, if anything, increased further. Hence, the message of my Jackson Hole speech continues to hold in spite of the expected slowdown in economic activity. Only a deep recession with a sharp rise in unemployment could be expected to significantly dampen inflationary pressures. And this is currently unlikely, not least due to the robust labor market, large excess savings, and the massive fiscal support to buffer energy price shocks for households and firms. Hence, there is no time for monetary policy to pause. We will need to raise rates further, probably into restrictive territory, to bring inflation back to our medium-term inflation target in a timely manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Schnabel. So focus, of course, central bank on inflation and also kind of your views, the institution's views, where we're going through. You mentioned at the very end the issue of the fiscal policy importance, I think the next two presenters in the panel will probably address, taking into account their positions. I would first ask the presentation, the introductory presentation of Mrs. Calviño, so maybe you can help me. She is already here with us. So, please.
Good afternoon. It is a great pleasure to participate in today's event hosted by the Bank of Slovenia. I wish I could have been there with you in person, but my presence in Madrid this afternoon was required. We meet at a time when, on top of the challenges derived from the pandemic, Russia's war against Ukraine is creating new risks, which go clearly beyond security. The shock in international markets for energy, food, and other raw materials has slowed down global growth and fueled inflation. Climbing interest rates are increasing economic and financial vulnerabilities worldwide. And against this background, I think that the discussion on interlinkages between economic policies and financial stability is very timely. And in order to help us take the right decisions and address current trade-offs in the best possible manner, we need to ensure that we fight inflation, which is a top priority for monetary policy authorities and also for government, but in a manner that safeguards growth and job creation, in a manner that is both fiscally responsible but also socially fair. For example, the Spanish economy is expected to grow at a rate above 4.4% this year and around 2% next year. And we will pursue an economic policy based on three key principles: fiscal responsibility, social justice, and structural reforms. And these three principles have been crucial in our response to the pandemic and now the war. And in this regard, the European Commission has just published its proposal on the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact, our common fiscal rules, which provides a good basis for our work in the coming months, with a view to having a fiscal framework which is fit for purpose, responding to current realities and future challenges too. Building on the lessons learned from the great financial crisis and taking account of the higher debt to GDP levels across the board as a result of the pandemic, it is important to focus on debt sustainability and design fiscal paths which are realistic and growth-friendly. Furthermore, the European Union needs massive public and private investment to drive the twin green and digital transitions and to reinforce our security and strategic autonomy. So our fiscal rules must enable the stabilization function of national budgets, protecting productive, future-proof investments and ensuring ownership of citizens. Spain will call for fast progress in the design of these revamped fiscal rules, and we will contribute constructively to these very important and timely debates. A coordinated and united approach at European level will be crucial to avoid any financial instability. Let me close with a reflection on the unprecedented challenges that we are confronted with. I think that we need to deal with what is urgent without losing sight of what is important. So beyond fighting inflation and supporting economic activity, we must accelerate the green transition. The swift rollout of the ambitious program of reforms and investment of the recovery plans remains of the essence to reinforce our security and strategic autonomy in all 5 dimensions: energy, agri-food, technology, industrial capabilities, and digitalization. I'd like to remind all of us that our decisions matter and that the future is not carved in stone. So what we do today will matter tomorrow. So let's respond to current challenges like we did in the pandemic, acting on the basis of unity, determination, and solidarity, because together we are stronger. Let me leave it here for now.
Well, thank you very much. This is Calviño. I think we got a complementary view on the...
Well, fiscal responsibility...
That's a little bit later. Because we have also some questions for her. What I would like to mention here is a strong reference to yesterday's proposal from the European Commission, right? Which in a way I think will really, to a large extent, shape the next, let's say, next months, how to make a new policy mix between the monetary and the fiscal, with the implications on the financial stabilities. I think we will come back. I hope we'll come back to this later on in the discussion. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Klemen Boštjančič. He has, in a way, similar position in Slovenia for his introductory intervention. Please.
Thank you very much. But my introductory speech, I will more focus into financial stability and in the banking system. But later, I believe most of the discussion will be regarding the trade-offs Ms. Calviño mentioned. So the measures we're taking, it's kind of always a trade-off between fighting the inflation, trying to implement structural reforms, and helping most vulnerable and, of course, the businesses in order to exit out of the crisis with the best possible starting position for the later growth. The Ministry of Finance, of course, it's by its basic task, it's well informed about the financial stability and the stability of the banking system. And we are aware of the general level of systemic risks to financial stability and of course, in Slovenia, like elsewhere in Europe, it remains elevated. Economic growth is conditioned by many uncertainties, which are exacerbated by military aggression in Ukraine. In this connection, of course, again, I'll mention inflationary pressures, uncertainties in the energy markets, new obstacles in supply chains, and so on. Deterioration of the macroeconomic outlook and higher inflation will, among other things, have negative impact on future operations and ability to repay banks' clients' debts. Despite some increased risk in bank operations, the important fact is that the resilience of the Slovenian banking system remains, in the terms of solvency, profitability, and liquidity, is rated as relatively good. The government's current work is largely conditioned by urgent responses to the elimination of the economic and social consequences of still COVID-19 pandemic and limiting or eliminating, I think it's more limiting, we cannot eliminate the consequences of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine, which by most of the organization, also the IMF, remains the most important factor in the current crisis. The government is, of course, aware of seriousness of what is happening in the international arena and its impact on the situation on the domestic environment. Therefore, in cooperation with the key stakeholders, it's preparing target-oriented measures, especially in the field of energy and food costs. Again, this is also something, I'm not trying to take the job of Mr. Mrak, but I think this is also some of the subject we could comment later, because something is theory and something, I wouldn't say completely different, but quite different is reality, what different countries are actually, what measures are taken. The Ministry of Finance recently, based on the warnings of the European Systemic Risk Board, proposed to the Bank of Slovenia that with the scope of its powers, it should issue a recommendation to banks regarding the risk arising from long-term loan contracts with a variable interest rate. In our opinion, this is quite significant risk, which is becoming bigger and bigger. And I think it's necessary to warn clients in a timely manner of the risk that those current circumstances bring and inform them about the possibilities and conditions of switching to a fixed interest rate. At the same time, in our opinion, it's also necessary to warn them of the fact that the expected interest rates can significantly increase the credit obligations of borrowers, which could lead to a situation that significantly exceeds their ability to repay. Generally, Boštjan, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the debate. I'm just coming from my last ECOFIN meeting, which was on Tuesday. Yesterday, your commission issued its view on new fiscal rules. And it was also interesting that just the day before that was issued, actually the ministers of finance were not really informed about what will be issued, which is somehow strange. But anyway, it's a complex situation and also tells a lot about the European Commission on one side and individual countries and the measures which are taken. So I think we will come to that later.
Thank you very much. We will indeed come back to these things later on. So we had a contribution which was more focused on the financial stability, which I think nicely complements this our introductory, let's say, stage. Let us now move to the both governors of national central banks. Mr. Peter Kažimir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having us here. It's a real privilege to be back here in Ljubljana, just to have the opportunity to share thoughts together with such a distinguished auditorium here. I would like to tell you a couple of words about our world, the world of central bankers. I think it's quite clear that the life of central bank in Europe, in UK, in the US, anywhere in the universe is currently a very difficult one. A class note has said it nicely in DC a couple of weeks ago. The monetary policy is currently more an art than science. I just do hope that it's more beauty art than knife art, definitely. So there's a suspicion that we are living in the world where what can go wrong is going wrong. And on top of everything, way too many cans are being kicked down the road everywhere in Europe and up on our doorstep in Frankfurt. And let me explain this lamentation in three remarks. Firstly, our job currently is to manage a persistent decline in living standards, at least relative to expectations. The immediate impact of the war in Ukraine on European households, business and economies is pretty painful. And rising energy and food prices coupled with the rising prospects of a recession. At the same time, situation in Europe is markedly different compared with US. Definitely is. So Europe is net importer of energy and food. And this crisis inevitably makes us poorer, at least in the short run. Problem is that the scares are going to last longer, much longer than we expected before. Deglobalization and friendshoring, as well as the lingering global political uncertainty, make the outlook worse than we expected before. So right now, our post-pandemic optimism is waning. In this environment, the best we can do is to make sure that demand in the economy adjusts to this uncertainty. So there is a danger, in my view, that once the worst of the crisis is over, then workers, trade unions, or firms, companies will try to claw back on some of the losses suffered previously. And governments also, we can be suspicious, governments also may be slow to unwind support. So fast income growth or widening profit margins could prevent the inflation from coming down to our goal. We have to act for that reason. So we have to act preemptively in circumstances in which there is a little reason to cheer. Secondly, pretty much all the risks are currently tilted to the higher inflation, in my view. So I have already mentioned a few reasons of future wage development and profit pressures or deglobalization. In the medium and longer term, we can add another factor, it's green transition to the, this must be also on the list. There's also a lot in the current developments that we have yet to understand fully. Isabel said last week that our economic models have limits in current situation, and I could not agree more. Higher energy and input prices affect firm decisions in a way that is different, much different from the past pattern. So the result may well be more persistent inflation with even stronger second round effects on wages. Current government interventions into pricing decisions, especially on energy, could also produce swings in inflation in the future. And finally, we have to talk about the fiscal policy, and we are going to talk about that, but the measures adopted at present are often far from the transitory and targeted interventions we would like to see. Current fiscal behavior is, in my view, rapidly becoming an inflationary risk. And future consolidation plans are not being spelled out, and the future EU fiscal framework remains unclear till yesterday. Hopefully, the more clarity we will get on that issue. And certainly, my final remark is that we at the ECB are European problem solvers. At last resort, we used to be. The blessing and curse of the ECB is that we can do timely and effective interventions to calm markets and restore trust in our economy. But the lack of a proper fiscal union, the lack of proper banking union, bring up issues almost on a daily basis. We have been providing quick fixes for years, and I'm afraid a bit our friends in governments around Europe have got used to this. We remain, despite all the friendly calls for action, the only game in town. So offering patch-up solutions has been easy for us when we were in the phase of supporting our economy to survive the worst and fend over the risk of inflation staying way too low for far too long. But that's over this period. So one could try and justify all kinds of interventions by the price stability mandate, but please let's do that. Supporting the economy and provide favorable financing conditions when necessary is one thing, and you can count on us. But even this carries all kinds of much hidden subsidies. And we have now come to the end of this road. Our price stability mandate requires us to reduce our presence in the markets and reduce our support to the economy. This will come. And in my view, the sooner, it's better. And it's absolutely vital for our credibility and for the stability of the euro area that this becomes widely recognized. Overall, the next few years are going to be an uphill struggle for all of us. Accidentally, there's a song running up that hill by Kate Bush. It's now back in rotation after decades, thanks to Netflix's Stranger Things. So we have a new anthem for this struggle, which is waiting for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you made very clear that we de facto need a kind of a new, or at least significantly adjusted macro policy mix at the EU level if we want to proceed in a kind of a manner which, well, I was personally, to be very honest, I was surprised how Europe was able over the last 10 years to overcome, to go through these several crises. So, and in my view, also the Eurozone today is a completely different structure than the Eurozone 10 years ago. Much better, I think. You have much more elements that you can do to deal with the crisis. But on the other side, it's becoming more and more clear that this this stop of the application of the fiscal rules and now re-establishing them are becoming really an important issue, and this will create a new policy mix. So that's very important. Mr. Vasle, I know that you had, of course, your introductory, but this was more a welcome probably for all of us. Please.
Thank you, Mojmir. So let me start my intervention by reiterating the fact how unique current economic situation is from the perspective of factors which led to it. On the back of what you mentioned, what happened in Europe in past decade, there were two events. Firstly, there was a pandemic, and we haven't seen a comparable event for more than 100 years. And then there was Russia aggression on Ukraine with all the consequences on energy prices and commodity prices in general. And here again, we have to go back away to see, to find similar episode on the European soil. So these two events are crucial for understanding current economic situation and also the response of economic policies. And this is not trivial, as Peter mentioned at the beginning of his intervention. First, there are growth developments. There was a strong rebound after the COVID crisis, stronger than expected, especially so in Slovenia. We were among the countries who recovered very, very early. But then there was an energy and commodity effects coming from Russia aggression, and the economy is losing momentum. It will probably stagnate, if not contract over the next quarters. There is also a strong weakening of confidence, despite the balance sheets of enterprises, households, and also banks are not problematic at the moment yet. Let's be on the safe side. So till now, even bigger effect of these two events is visible on inflation. It has been increasing for past quarters, and all started, of course, with the recovery from pandemic, with strong rebound of energy prices, with strong rebound with the demand. But this effect of rising prices were emphasized by the Russia aggression, again hit the commodity and especially energy prices. So after these two events, inflation, which started as a very particular episode, spread to other items and as well. So core inflation started to increase, and just to give you one figure, at the moment, the part of HICP index, which is growing by more than 5%, far increases 2/3 of all items included in the basket. So inflation is more and more broad-based and caused not only by supply factors, but also by demand factors. And what is even more worrisome is that we are not at the peak yet. Pipeline pressures are still significant, still very significant in terms of dynamics we are witnessing at the moment, and there are strong risks regarding wage developments, and probably not risks anymore, but there are also some real developments in this field which are heading into the wrong direction. Now, talking about the policy response, of course, when the nature of inflation changed, we reacted with monetary policy. First of all, we ended our new purchases under various program of asset purchases. We changed our forward guidance, and finally we reacted with interest rates. And let's not forget, this is one of the strongest campaigns regarding interest rates in past history. Important part of minimizing effects of our dealings on financial markets was introduction of special instruments, so-called transmission protection instruments, which is kind of a security for us, for the financial markets, and for the sovereigns that that changes which are ongoing will not affect markets in unorderly way. But this will not be enough. The nature of inflation and existing pressures I just mentioned, they require further steps to monetary policy. So what is needed, in my opinion, are further increases in interest rates, and here we will most probably have to go beyond the levels which are currently understood as neutral rates. And what is also needed is completion of the normalization process in terms of all instruments we used under the unconventional monetary policy instruments umbrella. And being concrete here, I'm talking about QT process. My opinion here is that the next year will be the appropriate time to start the exit process from the remaining part of unconventional instruments. But despite all of this, which is pretty much what I just highlighted, it will not be possible to tame inflation just by monetary policy. So the fiscal policy response will also be needed. And here I'm very much supporting the ideas circled by finance ministers at the moment, and that is that distributions of income will have to take an important part of their decisions at the moment. So it will not be possible anymore to react in the same manner as fiscal policy reacted during the COVID crisis with all over the board and very generous instruments, but these famous words starting with word T, which are used by finance ministers, so temporary and targeted instruments will be very welcomed to tame inflation. Also, in terms of wages, wealth increases will be needed in order not to cause the second round effects in terms of prices, wages spiral, which was so many times in the past the cause for even longer and more persistent inflation. So, without this combination of tight monetary policy and same fiscal policy, this inflation process will be first longer and second more costlier. So to conclude with, financial sector preparedness for these changes will also be crucial. When we are talking in financial system, maybe here in Slovenia we are too often having in front of our eyes just the banking system because it's so important, unproportionately important part compared to other Euro area countries of the financial system. But of course here the situation is very different to one which we had during the financial crisis more than 10 years ago. Banks are more resilient now, they are well capitalized and better prepared in general for the crisis, also of course due to support they receive from our side, from monetary policy side and also from fiscal policy side. But let's not forget that when we are talking about the whole Euro area, there are very important parts of the financial system which are non-banks, investment funds, pension funds, which are faced with significant risks at the moment. And we saw what happened in the UK when this risk was not taken care of properly.
Thank you, Mr. Vasle. I think we will continue on this monetary side with this, let's say, the first issue to be discussed a little bit more in detail. I'm sure that Mrs. Schnabel, you have already some comments on this, what was mentioned already. What are the, let's say, the inflationary and interest rate expectation for the forthcoming period? Are we basically, there was a lot of discussion about this, is this soft landing possible? Will we have to go to a little bit more, let's say, rough landing? Where do you see these developments over the, let's say, next year in this respect?
So thank you very much for the question. So let me stress first that of course we are still in a period of exceptional uncertainty, and this is also the reason why we are now refraining from kind of giving very clear guidance of what we are going to do in our upcoming meetings. I mean, we did communicate about the direction, so it's very clear that we are going to continue to raise interest rates. But apart from that, we switched to what we call a meeting-by-meeting approach, which means that we very closely monitor the incoming data, the developments in the economy, and then we decide in every single meeting what is a proper step to take. And so I cannot tell you precisely what is going to happen over the next year. The direction of travel, I think, is relatively clear. Boštjan also mentioned that at some point it's not only about interest rate, but it's also about what we call quantitative tightening. That is something that is going to come. So President Lagarde already said that we are going to lay out the principles for quantitative tightening, so the reduction of our bond holdings, in our December monetary policy meeting. Your question, of course, was also on the point, how does the economic development matter? And I think it's clear, and it was mentioned before, that the economic outlook has deteriorated. So in our previous projections, we did not have a recession in our baseline. Our next projection is going to come in December. I think it's clear that the risk of a recession has gone up, given the data that we have seen, and I cannot tell you where the projection will be precisely, but I think there is the impression that if there is a recession, this recession probably is not going to be very deep and not very prolonged, which matters for us because this will determine what the impact of that recession would be on our inflation outlook. And if the recession is not very deep and not very prolonged, I think the recession as such will not be sufficient to bring inflation down as much as is needed in order to get back to our inflation target over the medium term. And if that is the case, then we would get into a situation where we have to do more, and that is precisely, of course, what we will have to see.
Thank you very much. We really have an excellent participant for the monetary side, so all the questions could be put to each of you. So you can also then react to the one to another, even though I know that you sit then in the same table for the decision makings. But still, you mentioned in your introductory intervention the Jackson Hole discussion this year, but I remember the Jackson Hole discussion last year. There was this issue at that time, inflation. Is it temporary? Is it not temporary? That was at that time still an issue, but then you saw relatively quickly the developments on the side of the Fed, of the Bank of England, but much later in the ECB. I would ask Mr. Kazimir to comment on this. Why the ECB was here? Is the reason of the deficit, the inflation, the difference? Because there is a difference, that's clear. You have a feeling, or at least I had a feeling, and sometimes I have to be a little bit more provocative, that there was a little bit of a delay. I still remember January comments from the Philip Lane, temporary January this year, and then change. Now you are saying we were having the growth announcements, which will probably go lower. So yes, the situation changes. I think today to do the macro projections, it's a hell of a work because from one day to another the thing can change. So please.
Professor, I'm the member of the team also, so and among the youngest one I belong, so yes, the temporary or no temporary. I think this also is over, So this is a real experience which we have, and when we are talking about the forecasting, it's pretty difficult now, So this is bloody work for all of us. I think at the ministerial level or in the central banks, And so simply just to live in the world where after COVID, we were facing to the persistence of bottlenecks on the same time on huge demand on certain goods and energies, so it's really puzzled us in this area. So I think our role is just to be predictable, as accountable as so much as is possible. So, and we try to do our best. That we were tightened by our forward guidance, which was, I think, pleased by markets, because the markets, they love forward guidance everywhere, So, but now we changed the approach, because the situation, it's such uncertain that this meeting by meeting approach I think is much better for the both sides, And I think we are honest here, that I think that what we addressed before and now also, that it's really the time of accommodative monetary policy, it's over, and we are on the way, on this way to the normalization. And then I fully agree with Isabel here that my perception is, and in my view, we will have to go further, so more to the restrictive part of that, and it's quite normal, and it's not going to be drama.
Kind of find interesting. Well, I don't know, it's interesting. We had these 10 years of the monetary policy all over the world, which was going on, and now we are going to a kind of a normalization of this. And we are talking now about inflation rate of interest rate of 1-2%, and it is sometimes portrayed as something extraordinary, so that we are in a completely now in an abnormal situation, because the perception was that was normal after 10 years, and now this what is I still think very much normal one. We are portraying this as a problem. This is on the different segments of the economy. I remember, of course, I'm a little bit old through, but the inflation rate, the interest rate of Fed in 81 was 21%. So of course, I'm not saying that this is something similar to that, but the interest rate of 4, 5, 6 in this range was a kind of a normal interest rate. Now we are having a big discussion now about 1%, 2%. And then we talk about the fiscal issues. We consider the situation when the growth rate is around 0, 1%, that this is already a disaster. You have to adjust to, let's say, a new normal. I think these growth rates will be lower, but also then the fiscal policy will, in my view, will have to adjust to this, because otherwise financial markets will adjust us at certain point. Just one final comment, maybe Mr. Vasle, on these monetary sides. This issue of to what extent, of course, inflation is at the level of this. To what extent this is already getting into the wages, and then of course then we have secondary impact. I will not ask you about the exchange rate issue of these developments. But if somebody would like to comment, I am aware of the monetary authorities don't act in context of the exchange rates, but de facto what's going on, we were seeing the significant changes in the exchange rate among the major currencies.
Now, as for wage developments, there was a long delay, relatively long delay between the increase of inflation, between the notion that inflation is becoming more broad-based, so not something temporary, but something which is becoming more persistent, and the reaction of wages. Now, it's true that to some of the economies, this was coming as a surprise, but the fact is that looking at the previous episode of inflation, it's a usual phenomenon to have this delay between increases in prices and then wages following this, especially at the beginning of inflation episode, and especially after a period of almost a decade when we were all fighting too low inflation and engineering instruments to bring inflation to 2% from the lower side. So what is for me, and I agree with you here, very crucial is what will happen with wages in the next quarter, in the next year. And here I'm afraid that some very negative developments are already happening. All these increases of wages we are seeing in some parts of euro area, and especially for a small and open economy as Slovenia, in countries which are much bigger in a way, which are leading the game in this area. These increases are really something which worries all us, and that's why we started with quite fast normalization of our policy. Let's not forget percentage point in approximately 3 months is a big step forward. Now, as for the exchange rate, there are various reasons.
Because it has also inflationary implications. This is in this context.
Yeah. And as for the exchange rate, there are many reasons for current developments in terms of euro-dollar exchange rate. Let's not forget that in times of stress, of big uncertainty, dollar is always a safe haven, and this is an important part of the story. But otherwise, of course, when we are thinking about future steps of monetary policy, we are always taking into consideration broader set of indicators, and exchange rate, also on the major one, the one we are targeting, is something which is on the table when we are deciding on the future steps of monetary policy. And in a way, it's also a reflection of different stage of monetary policy normalization here in Europe and USA. And so, as I said, this is part of deliberations we are having with our council.
You wanted to add or to
yes, actually,
complement?
it's a somewhat a general point related to both questions that you asked before, which is, I think, that we are learning that the speed with which shocks kind of feed through the economy and into prices, inflation, and so on, depends very much on institutional features. And so, for example, if you look at what happened in the US in the pandemic, so they had a very different approach to the pandemic, and actually there were quite a few people losing their jobs in the US during the pandemic, but the government sent checks, right? Whereas in Europe, we had all these job retention schemes and unemployment hardly moved. And that, of course, has very important implications then for what happens with wages. So what happened in the US is that all these people that had been laid off, they were then looking for a new job. And when you look for a new job, of course, you try to get the best deal and you start to negotiate. It is one of the reasons why wages started to rise much earlier in the US, which then, of course, also is visible in inflation. And and that means the reaction on wages in Europe tends to be much later, even though even within the euro area, we have quite some distinction between different countries, which also have very different institutional settings. And then the same is true for many other things. If you think about the pass-through from like wholesale energy prices to consumer energy prices, I mean, that depends very much on what type of contracts you have in an economy. And we are just now learning these things and how much they matter. And they're, of course, not in the standard models, which are, I mean, in a sense, too stylized to capture all these institutional features. But for the dynamics of inflation, that matters enormously.
Thank you. Very good explanation. I would propose that we move to the other topic. But of course, it's very difficult to say. I think we were talking already now quite a bit on the fiscal side. Now, when we go to the fiscal side as such, I don't think we will talk that much about the inflationary side, but still. Europe has gone, you know, after this financial crisis, I think we reacted to that financial crisis with a very strong austerity issues. The whole this fiscal framework which was done was pretty much based on fiscal consolidation, but very quick fiscal consolidation. Now, when we have the last two crises, the reaction on the fiscal side was very different. It was very different. Of course, also the central bank in 2010 and the central bank at the beginning of the COVID is a different not formally different central bank, but in terms of the instruments, it was quite different. What I'm saying is that on the fiscal side, we had first a big reaction on the national public finances, the fiscal rules were suspended. And then we had also at the EU side, de facto the new generation of the EU budget. So we had a pretty strong expansionary fiscal side, and it would be good to have now views of the people from the high officials from the both ministries which we have at the table, Ms. Calviño, and then I would also like to ask the same or similar question Mr. Boštjančič about this issue. So I asked Mrs. Calviño, of course, I prepared this in advance because she's not with us. What was her country's response to all these recent crises, particularly on the fiscal side and on the side of the structural reforms? Because we put a lot of efforts, if you remember, through this six-pack, through the two-pack, through this European semester, to go more strongly, not just on fiscal consolidation, because it was clear that the crisis was not just fiscal crisis, it was a macroeconomic crisis, and where we are on this. So I would like to, if you can help me getting Mrs. Calviño's response to this, please.
Well, fiscal responsibility, as I said a moment ago, is one of the guiding principles of our economic policy since 2018. And so we are taking advantage of strong growth and extraordinary employment developments to advance in our fiscal consolidation path. Thanks to stronger than expected public revenues on the back of the outstanding evolution of consumption, investment, and employment, thanks to the recovery plan, without any doubt, we have registered in 2021 the largest reduction in the deficit to GDP ratio in history. So we already started last year absorbing the extra cost of the pandemic response. We've been able to reduce the public debt ratios, and we will comfortably meet the targets set for 2022 also. Our medium-term fiscal consolidation path will allow us to reach deficit and debt levels below 3% and 110% of GDP, respectively, in 2025. And it is important to note that this deficit reduction has been compatible with an effective and decisive response to the pandemic and now to the war. And I think that thanks to this strategy of prudence and fiscal responsibility, we've been able to take advantage of a context with extraordinarily low interest rates in recent years to refinance our debt and progressively reduce the cost. So today, Spain pays for its public debt on average less than half of what it did in 2011. And the interest burden relative to GDP has continued to fall despite the increase in the level of debt due to the pandemic. So in short, economic growth together with fiscal responsibility and the Treasury's excellent management is the best way forward to ensure fiscal sustainability in the mid to long run too.
Thank you very much. I would now have to turn to Mr. Boštjančič. It's not maybe precisely the same question, but you're half a year in these shoes. At the time when you came, the inflation was going quickly up. I remember that was the period that also the public finance revenues were going very quickly up. On the other side, on the expenditure side, this was not felt yet that much at the beginning. And now, of course, the new budget is here. What's the situation in the ministry in this respect? Public finance, the issue of the sovereign borrowings, how do we feel this? I think now being part of the Eurozone, it's a good thing. I follow a little bit situation in some other parts of the, let's say, Central and Eastern Europe, and you see that some countries are having very growing problems in terms of borrowing, in terms of the price, and even of the excess.
Well, it's a complex question. Honestly, one of the first things we did after the new government took a position with the Ministry of Finance, I mean, from today's perspective, of course, I hope that in half a year and a year from today, I will be able to be more optimistic. But from today's perspective, I may say that we were quite good in predicting. So we we were preparing for the worsening of the situation. So the first thing we were focusing was the state treasury, and we wanted to be prepared in the case that the crisis will worsen, that we have enough room, meaning high liquidity, in order to be able to implement whatever measures we will think that will be necessary. Also, at the time when this government started work, the liquidity was quite good, but actually in one of the first meetings, I also required that remains that should be even higher. So today, the liquidity of the Ministry of Finance is really high, one of the highest in EU. The second thing which is important, which was done in the past, is extremely good work of our treasury, which came well prepared for the crisis. So actually that the sharp increase in the interest rates were actually well mitigated. Just a few numbers. For the next year, we have only 1.5 billion for the debt redemption, which is one of the lowest numbers in years and probably in the next years. The state budget exposure to the floating rate is below 1%, and actually the interests we'll be paying in 23 will be actually lower than in 22. Of course, it will increase in 24 and 25, but in this regard, the Treasury is well prepared. Regarding the fiscal and structural, so we don't have to worry that say in simple terms, we won't have funds to finance whatever we believe it's necessary in the coming months. Regarding the fiscal and structural policies, of course, also in Slovenia, social transfers are to great extent links with inflation. And because of the inflation, there's also, like elsewhere, pressure on public wages. However, it's important that we reached agreement that the increase is kind of below the inflation rate. Generally, not just, okay, this is something, of course, which waits for us in the future, but generally I'm well against the linkage of to the inflation. As you know, some of the Benelux countries have their salaries linked to the inflation, which causes today a big problem for them. But anyway, everybody agrees that the fiscal measures should be targeted and temporary. It's all about targeted and temporary. Everybody talks about it. But then again, 2 days ago, the analysis of the European Commission showed that 70% of the fiscal measures within the EU countries were not targeted, were general. So one thing is theory, the other thing is practice. I absolutely agree it's of utmost importance that we work hand in hand with the monetary policy, and it's important then that the fiscal policy do not give additional pressure on inflation. In this regard, I think Slovenia, I mean, at the end of the day, I really believe in numbers, not too much in just talking. And I just yesterday I got the recent numbers of the inflation rates in European countries, and Slovenia, I wouldn't say it's, of course, it's still, inflation is still high, but if you look very carefully, is one of the few countries where our inflation rate was growing till July, and it's dropping from July every month. By the way, Spain is the second country, which is also quite successful, and there's not more than 5 countries in Europe that achieved this. And of course, I mean, still, we are quite limited on what we can do. At the end of the day, we're not, you know, we don't live in a bubble. It's whatever the decisions are taken elsewhere are very much influence the other countries. For example, 1 month ago, just before the previous ECOFIN meeting, I think it was a day before, 2 days before, there was information with this 200 billion worth package of German German measures which will help economy and households, and there was only the discussion on the ECOFIN. I mean, to everyone I spoke was just worried that, you know, tomorrow we're going back to our home countries. The journalists are already calculating if Germany was putting 200 billion, and if you calculate to your national GDP, you know, Slovenia should put that much, Slovakia should put that much. That's kind of, at the end of the day, we all know it's a lot of a PR behind this. And then I don't want to talk too much about the German measures, but if you look carefully what's in this 200 billion, yeah, it's a lot of PR. But anyway, so basically, the difficulty is that we are trying our best to and I agree also some of the measures our government took were not targeted. You know, the lowering of the VAT is obviously not a targeted measure, but during the last couple of weeks we are more and more there, and we had serious discussion with the government, with the other ministries, and I'm really happy to say that in the last 1 or 2 months, we as a government became aware that we should work together. So the recent measures have been and will be really, really targeted. But then again, I think if you, like I said, if you look at the number, we achieved a lot, but then again, there is no, of course, common European fiscal policy. In this regard, I'm happy that we have to deal with just one central bank. And I'm really, no, honestly, I think as a Minister of Finance, I absolutely see them as my ally. It's actually easier to work also with the decisions on the fiscal side if you know what's happening on the monetary side. So, and then that's somehow easier also for us for the decisions which we are now taking and which we probably will have to take in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you. I think you gave us a little bit of a flavor of the ECOFIN environment, which is not something what somebody would like to hear, no? But that's a real life, as you said. So I think these discussions now will indeed be very, 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 let's say, lively at this point. I would like to ask the central bankers if there is any comment on what we heard on the fiscal side before we move to the financial stability component. Please.
So when we go back to the pandemic, and it was a bit alluded to by Peter. I mean, that was a situation when we were still close to what we call the effective lower bound of interest rates, right? And that is a very special macroeconomic situation in which, like, standard macroeconomic models would say that on the one hand, monetary policy is a bit constrained because we can not lower interest rates to the degree that we would like to. And on the other hand, fiscal policy becomes particularly effective. And the reason is the following. I mean, normally when you have an expansionary fiscal policy, then this puts pressure on the central bank to raise interest rates. But when the central bank is at these very low levels where it actually would like to lower interest rates, that is not happening. That means interest rates in the economy do not go up, and you do not get this typical, what economists call the crowding out effect of private investments. But interest rates basically stay low, and that makes fiscal policy very effective in such a situation. So now, of course, the situation has changed completely. We are in a situation where we are away from the lower bound, and when fiscal policy becomes too expansionary, monetary policy needs to react, interest rates in the economy move up, and that actually crowds out private investment. So public expenditure crowds out private investment. And actually, I mean, you mentioned that expenditures were not very targeted, and I think there's a lot of evidence for that. But there's also, it was hardly any public investment. It's almost all consumption, transfers, and so on. So hardly any investment. The problem that we are facing at the moment is mainly a supply side problem. So we have all types of supply side issues, which require, as a solution, they require structural solutions from the government. And this requires public investment, but we are not seeing that. There's hardly anything on public investment. And in addition, there is this crowding out of private investment. And if we think of all the investment that will be needed going forward for the green transition, digitalization, and so on, this is really, I mean, this is a problem because we're dealing kind of with the symptoms, but we are not dealing with the causes. And I think that's really a big issue.
Yeah.
One thing I absolutely believe that this time of the crisis, and I hope that we will be able to show some significant results by the end of next year, that's actually the right time to boost reforms and structural measures. It's if you do it right, it's easier in these circumstances than you don't have this. So, and absolutely, our government tends to do some serious structural reforms, mostly during next year. Health reform, tax reform, probably also we'll start with the pension reform. But the other thing which was mentioned was the investments. In our budget in 2022, we had 1.9 billion of investments, which was historically highest. Because I mean, at the end, we will have 1.4 to 1.5 billion realization because honestly, the absorption is not, we don't have enough capacity to actually execute it. But next year in 23, in our budget, is over 2.3 billion of investments. So, and by its nature, the investments work, against some of the monetary policy. I mean, it will, of course, not help to bring down the inflation. But on the other hand, the problem is, and we're experiencing this year, and we will, I'm sure, next year, is that most of these investments are, linked to the construction industry, and this can just not happen overnight. So this is a problem we're experiencing. But luckily, it's because three different EU perspectives. I mean, from the cohesion are covering next year. So that's the main reason why the investments next year will be historically highest.
Well, thank you. I think, yeah, of course.
A couple of words on fiscal policy. First of all, I have to appreciate the sincere words of Mr. Minister, because I see that nothing has changed, and on the other side, everything has changed in outside world, So, and this is my assessment after 7 years being the member of the team of finance minister in Europe, So, what we have to really appreciate what the fiscal policy played during the pandemic. But now, as the minister said, if we are complaining about the the fiscal policy that is not targeted, that 70% of additional expenditures are not targeted. What does it mean? That means that our structural expenditures are going up, and what does it mean? That is going also will go up. So in the situation when the real conditions for the financing of debt are worsening. So this is not very responsible, just to be very honest on the side. And here, and I'm not going to blame the ministers now, because it's extremely difficult for governments and for politicians a little bit. Must remember, because I'm a former politician, but to go through this, painful valley with the high energy, with unbelievable high inflation, with the pressure on vulnerable groups, and in political cycle, which is different from one country to another country. What I would like to little bit to blame is the role of Commission here, because what I lack, there's a certain level of coordination. If you remember, this is anecdote, but our British friends, they were complaining about that the Commission is sticking nose everywhere, every spot, every pot, But where was the Commission at the beginning of pandemic? Where was a Commission with the best practices, for example, with manual list of measures, for ministers, just to help the governments, to which direction is the best, is not so costly, should be approached the OECD or or the different
so we need
institutions.
a
So that's a problem, which is I think it's quite real one, because when somebody is minister or is a member of the government, I think I do believe that they try to do their best, but when in the world where all rules has been suspended, or have been suspended, where there's a lack of coordination, where there's a really risk of the problems with some finance of debt. I'm pleased with this fact that the Commission finally came up with a new proposal of SGP. Finally. Probably you're not satisfied with the way how they did it, but finally it's something that's on the table. And for me, NGEU, for example, it's a great satisfaction, because I was always on the side of further integration, and this process, which is politically extremely difficult and will be. But this is the only proper way how to achieve the real coordination between the monetary and fiscal policy, because we are suffering for decades by these huge gaps which are in the architecture of our monetary union. And fiscal union is one of these gaps.
I have intention to go to the financial stability, but I will stay a few moments more, because you came to this, fiscal, particularly this program. Yeah, I think the Eurozone governance is different today. And I think that's what was done during the COVID, with this increase of the, if you want, EU budget. It's temporary, I know, it's everything I know, but it is basically strengthening the risk-sharing part of the fiscal architecture of the EU. On the other side, on the national side, on the fiscal rules, we had this vacuum now for 2 years. There were different ideas for this, and it's very interesting that nothing came out from the Commission. I made already today some comments on the proposal, but I would like to ask my minister, what is your comment, let's say, on the first reading on this? Because obviously there were different options. One was simply to give more freedom to the Commission in terms of the assessment, no changing numerical things. The other option was to change the fiscal rules, and this is the change of fiscal rules. The third option was also to go just the fiscal norms, which I would be personally strongly against in this where we are at the moment. So we have now, there was this issue of the investments, green investments, light green, more green, little bit more green. So now we have general investments in this. How do you see after the first reading this document?
My previous comment was kind of on the way how it was done. I wasn't the only one at ECOFIN, that just the day after the meeting finishes, the EU decides to come out with a proposal. So probably it's easier to have a month.
But that was already some delay with coming to this. Huh?
Yeah, I don't think it was a coincidence anyway. So, well, somehow, of course, it's not a surprise. We all knew that this is the direction that the Commission goes, and frankly, we support it. And again, as a Minister of Finance, I absolutely support the rules. Honestly, it's easier to live within the government with the rules. And I'm referring to the current chief of Eurogroup, Pascal Donahue, who said a few months ago, that it's the loneliest job in the world, being a Minister of Finance. So, yeah, I mean, it's too soon to comment, but generally, I think it's how it's structured. It puts a lot of responsibility to the member states, actually, because it depends. Of course, you will have to prepare your own plan, and then you will have to follow it. And of course, there are consequences if you don't follow it. So in this regard, I hope Slovenia will be able to prepare a plan which will help us do what I mentioned before, which is, by the way, of course, one of the paramount of the idea, that through the plan executing reforms and while reducing the relative debt. In the past, not on this field, but Slovenia was well known to be, I'm not sure whether it's the same translation, more Pope than the Pope. So in this regard, I really hope we'll be able to prepare a plan which will help us do what we need to do. And so in this regard, I see this as probably a good help coming from Brussels. It's absolutely gives kind of an increased national ownership by proposing medium-term structure plans, and this has to be reflected with the national budgets, and kind of a longer and more gradual path to reforms and investments. So actually, it's basically what we're trying to do today, putting this on the paper and executing it. I believe that the problems might be in details, but like I said, it's too soon to comment this. Generally, again, Slovenia was quite successful at reducing relative debt during the last couple of years, even though our budget for next year, at least from the Ministry of Finance view, doesn't look too good with over 5% of the deficit. But still, the relative debt should go to 70% of the GDP by 2024, which we are quite well below the EU average.
Well, thank you. I think on this issue, I'm sure we will discuss still a lot, nationally, internationally. Maybe just one last segment, if we can touch these financial stability issues. Where do you governors see this? What are the main vulnerabilities which we may face if, well, we are now going probably into a recession? It will not be what is not kind of expected to be very
strong, but still, where do you see potential major problems in this area? And give both of you the room to address this.
If I can start, what we see, so that I would like to be very, just to focus on our national level. Definitely, we see the problem in credit risk. And this moment, it seems to us that households seem to be less vulnerable than enterprises. I think this is the main message which we have here. Based on our estimation, from 17 to 25% corporate loans might be at risk by the end of 2024. And just talking about the households, so it's really different because in household situation, as a result of combination of high inflation, rising interest rates, and potential also some rise in unemployment later on in regards of a recession, possible recession, the housing loans at level 4% of housing loans and about 6% of consumer loans could become at risk in baseline scenario back in our country, which I think it's you see this difference. What is interesting that not all households will face a negative impact due to high inflation. It's quite interesting that thanks to a significant increase in nominal wages, 40% of households might see even some improvement in their financial situation. What's also could be interesting, I think, and it's a risk, long-run risk. I'm a little bit worried about the long-term competitiveness of our corporates. These countries with relatively expensive energy mix, and this is also our case, might have difficulties to compete with other competitors, in Asia, in the US, but also in Germany, for example, when they go further with their plans how to shield the SMEs or certain sectors with subsidies. So I think this is on corporate side and household side. When we are talking about the banks, I think really the banks are resilient enough now. They will weather the storm. Definitely, the level of NPL, non-performing loans, will depend on the direction of the government or the prices in the situation. And of course, there will be winners and losers in the situation. Possibly, in my view, that losers now will be much more difficult than during the pandemic for them. So it won't be rosy, especially for so-called zombies enterprises or the parts of the economy, because everywhere we have some forgotten iconic distinguished companies which are not very we are not able to stand on our legs, without the subsidies from the state or from the financial market. So that's it.
Now, a bit of honesty to start with. It's definitely the fact that high inflation is not helping financial stability in general. So that's why we are so determined to bring inflation down again and restore the price stability, which is so closely related to financial stability. Then being more concrete on the banking sector, due to developments and lessons we learned from the previous financial crisis, now banks are in a different shape as compared to the crisis which started in 2008. Especially here in Slovenia, we went through a big process of cleaning up of the bank's balance sheet, of recapitalizing the banks, of changing their ownership structure as well, and now the governance of the banks is better, more capable to cope with all the consequences of the crisis. there is also a different regulatory environment for the institutions which were built, designed after the previous financial crisis are definitely helping to retain financial stability. And the third element I've already mentioned is with support we central bankers, ministries of finance are providing to the enterprise sector, to the household sector, and as a consequence to the banking sector. However, there are some important risks in front of us when we are talking about the financial stability of the banking sector. And this is this fear we are sharing in Sweden with colleagues from other members of Euro states, member states, I believe, and this is that banks are not taking seriously enough the possible downturn of economic activity and all the consequences it might have on their clients. So at the moment, the situation is very favorable, but there are risks for what will happen in the next quarters. And of course, as I've also already mentioned, there are other segments besides banks in the financial system. And here in the overall Euro area environment, we are seeing increased risks with non-banks sector, and there are some areas which are not exactly part of the financial sector, but closely related to it, like cryptosphere, which are extremely exposed to different kinds of risk we are facing at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Of course, and then I will open the floor to
I'm sorry. Just,
no. Of course.
Just one point I wanted to make is the following. I mean, if you look at our previous financial stability reports, and I'm sure that's also true for those by the national central banks, I mean, there were always warnings about all the risks that come from a long period of low interest rates. So like excessive risk-taking, liquidity mismatches, overvaluation of assets, also in the real estate sector, and so on. So basically, these risks, of course, then materialize when interest rates go up. But I think it's important to understand that the risks are not caused by the rising interest rates, but the risks were built up over a long period of time in the financial system. And I think that it matters where this comes from. But so it's not that the financial stability risk comes from the increase in interest rates. And but of course now, I mean, part of the corrections that we are seeing are also healthy. So if we see that stretched asset valuations correct a bit in an orderly fashion, I mean, be it financial assets or be it real estate, that's actually a healthy development. It doesn't have to be bad. But we of course see that financial markets in the current situation, I mean, they are a bit jittery. So there is a lot of volatility, there is low liquidity, and in such situations, one can get situations that are very problematic, as we've seen in the UK. And that, of course, goes back to this whole issue about the non-banks, which are showing quite substantial liquidity mismatches. There is a lack of regulation. So I think that is one of the big regulatory failures, that even though we've been talking about the regulation of, especially the macroprudential regulation of non-bank financial institutions for such a long time, basically very little has happened. And so for us at central banks, it's actually very important to have a well regulated and supervised financial system, because this also protects our independence. So that's quite important.
Let me now open the floor for questions, comments. We'll take a couple of them. Please, I would appreciate that you introduce yourself, and then, either to say to whom this is addressed, and the other thing is, if it's not, that to the panel as a whole, and then we will see who will take it over.
So, hello everyone, Simon Saušek, European Investment Bank. I would first like to thank Bank of Slovenia for organizing this great event. I would like to have one clarification question for Governor Kazimir. You were talking about these scenarios, how many households and corporates might be affected, but I didn't exactly understand the scenario. Is it higher interest rates, or is it higher inflation for longer? I didn't completely grasp that part. And I think that Ms. Schnabel now opened up a very important issue where financial stability, monetary and fiscal policy come together, which is the housing market. And my question is more or less, have we learned anything from the previous crisis that would prevent that this, let's say, adjustment is not problematic going further? Because in some countries, as for example, ESRB report showed, there are quite high overvaluations of these assets.
Thank you. I think it was addressed to Mr. Kazimir and to...
It's a very precise question. Just to be very honest, this is a combination of all three factors which you mentioned, because this is really not just about energy prices, because it's also interesting information that before war, energy costs represented on average only 4% of total costs in our industry. So this is simply the combination of factors which we can name as a bloody factors like surge of energy prices, but also the secondary effects, like the surge in labor costs and other goods which are also goods and services. These inflationary pressures on growing number of goods and services which are connected to the production. And there's what's extremely important, it's ability of these companies to transmit high costs on customers. And this is very diverse, So these figures are coming from real figures in our country.
So on the housing market, of course, on the regulatory side, a lot has happened. There is quite a bit of macroprudential regulation regarding the mortgages, I would say that we are better protected than we were previously. But that is, of course, not to say that there's full protection. Probably not. But I would say the protection is much better because depending on the country, but there have been limits on, for example, loan-to-value ratios and so on. And so, in that sense, I think the system is more robust. Also, there have partly been shifts from variable rates to loan rates on the to fixed loan rates in the mortgage sector, which may protect the households who have taken up mortgages. Of course, someone has to bear the interest rate risk, and that could, of course, be that would, of course, then be the bank. I think one has to separately look, of course, at different segments of the real estate sector. We are talking about the residential real estate sector, but there's, of course, also the commercial real estate sector, which is now undergoing quite substantial structural changes. For example, due to the fact that online shopping has become more important in certain commercial real estate is simply likely to lose value over time, or has already done so. So there are certain pockets of risk, but I think we are better protected than we used to be.
Okay, we have another question or comment.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Stanislava Zadravec, Banking Association of Slovenia. I have a question for me, for Dr. Schnabel, and also for, it's the same question for Governor Kazimir and Governor Vasle. First question, you've already addressed to a certain extent, but nevertheless, I would like to hear what is your view on whether the past experiences on monetary policy measures dealing with the high inflation and the theoretical, I would say, theoretical framework of the past applies to current circumstances. What is different today? Second, related is, how do you position the monetary responses into the current level of globalization, current stage of globalization? Do you see that there are any elements that decrease the effectiveness of channeling into Europe? And the last question is, the European Central Bank in modeling, in the models that you also look at when deciding your monetary decisions, take into account, let's say, the certain levels of permanent increase in energy prices that would be due to investments in diversification of energy, and whether you were looking at this, and do you think that that could in a longer run also impact the level of, more permanently, the level of inflation? Because current levels of energy prices are seen as a temporary, and they impact substantially the current levels of inflation. But if we are to shift the energy, diversify energy, this may also more permanently increase the cost of energy for Europe.
I would propose that maybe you share the questions, because we have slowly to wrap up. So I'm leaving first, invite Mrs. Schnabel, and then maybe the two governors can comment.
So is it okay if I comment on the last question and leave you the
leave to the host the most difficult one.
So no, I think it's an interesting question. What is going to happen to energy prices going forward? I mean, of course, we are more concerned about changes in energy prices than levels, but levels, of course, matter for the economy. That's clear. But when we talk about inflation, the question is what is the trend? By the way, I think there is a common view that that energy prices are not going to fall back to the level where they were before the pandemic. I think that's relatively clear. And there are actually reasons to believe that energy prices are going to rise further, and this is related to the green transition. So one of the issues is that we know, even though we all want to move towards renewable energies, that we cannot do so immediately, but that will take time. And so in the meantime, we will still be very much reliant on fossil fuels. But on the other hand, there is kind of a decreased incentive to invest in production facilities of non-renewable energies, because hopefully everybody expects that we are going to move. And so that means that in this transition period, actually the fossil energy prices are very likely to increase quite a bit. So that's one thing. The second thing is that there's hopefully going to be this push towards renewable energies, and these renewable energies rely very much on particular raw materials, especially like metals, like copper, lithium, and so on. So when there is this massive shift into renewable energies, there will be a very high demand for those raw materials, which will, in the transition period again, make also renewable energies more expensive. I mean, I think most people believe that over the longer run, once the transition has been accomplished, energy prices may be lower, or at least not increase further. But in the transition period, I think it is to be expected that they're going to rise further. I mean, there's a bit of speculation here, of course, but that would be my best guess.
Do my best to a little bit answer to the question about globalization, and I think this is an appropriate question to me because I'm coming from the country which is, in my view, a happy child of globalization. And we as car makers, we are really, I think, a very good example of that. But what I've said before, it's the everything have changed in the world. So now I think the reality which we are facing is that deglobalization and the process is reversing, you know. So and again, the chart of deglobalization is going to be friendshoring. And here I'm a little bit doubt if we are just ready in Europe for these processes, you know, and if we are ready from the policy making level to react, because just to be ready for that, it means to act together maybe, you know, and not to compete, because otherwise we could just to fail. I think this is temptation. I think there will be temptation to misuse this process on the national level, but hopefully we'll be capable enough to act all together and to just to react to that, you know, because that means that certain capacities could go back home to the Europe, you know, just to be very, just to explain to you in the easiest way. And of course, we dealt with the problem of globalization during this period of too long for long, you know, when we were complaining about the pass-through effect and all these issues, but also we remember how the globalization caused the problem with bottlenecks, with shortages on semiconductors and all these real issues in real life, that's reality which we are facing now.
Thank you. And the last word goes to Mr. Vasle, please.
Thank you. So mine is the question on what is similar to previous episodes, what's different, and what can we learn. Now, regarding the differences, of course, to start with, the nature of inflation is different as opposed to previous episodes. It was induced by one-off factors, by outside factors, and not by some weaknesses of our domestic economies. Then the second thing which is different now is that we entered this episode with a completely different setup of monetary policy as opposed to previous episodes, very low inflation, lower bound problems, and unconventional instruments as well. And of course, what is different is that there were a lot of new findings in terms of theoretical background, and of course, Peter will tell you it's enough to classify us as science, or are we still in the domain of art? But you know, the knowledge involved. But saying that there are also a lot of similarities between different inflation episodes, and what I can say from my personal experience is that it's a great benefit for me that I lived through two different inflation episodes here in Slovenia, first after the breakup of former Yugoslavia, and then with high inflation just before we joined Euro. So so there are a lot of similarities. It helps you to understand better how inflation expectations are getting built, how strong pass-through of different prices to other prices can be. So it's at the same time, yeah, very different, but some of the principles are still the same.
Thank you very much. I think at this point I will try to wrap up this hour roundtable. I would like to thank, first of course, the audience to be with us, this one here in the room and that one virtually who is with us. I would like to thank all the panelists for, at least for me, it was an extremely interesting discussion on the issues which can be discussed for hours. I try to keep to the timing which we have here. And of course, last but not least, thank you to the Bank of Slovenia, to the governor for organizing this event, which I hope that in one or another way you will continue to have this kind of events. So thank you very much, and I wish you a good continuation of the day in the evening. Thank you.